For nearly 50 years, Saturday Night Live has been on the air, and in that time they've put together some of the most memorable sketch comedy in television history, while also providing some of the most talented comedians and actors the push they needed to get their big break. But along the way, there have been many stars of the show who NBC harshly fired or laid off, and some of these decisions were highly questionable and were widely criticized by longtime fans of Saturday Night Live. These are some of the victims of Saturday Night Live who were fired for a multitude of different reasons, including performance issues, decline in ratings, budget cuts, or failure to adhere to requests made by producers at NBC. Norm Macdonald. Every list has a beginning, and this is mine. Starting off with Adam Sandler. Adam joined Saturday Night Live as a writer in 1990, and just a year later, he worked his way up to being a cast member on the show. At this time, Sandler was in the process of making a name for himself, making small appearances in TV shows and movies, while also performing stand-up comedy at comedy clubs all across the country. NBC saw potential in Sandler because of his musical ability, and this would lead to him creating some original musical skits that would be very memorable during the years he was active on the show. A few of my personal favorites were Lunch Lady Land with comedian Chris Farley and the Hanukkah segment during Weekend Update. However, along the way, Sandler rubbed the executive producers of NBC the wrong way, as he insisted that they did not like him and some of his peers for some of their antics behind the scenes of the show. Lorne Michaels was outwardly very fond of Adam Sandler and his unique style of comedy, but this would not be enough to keep him on the show. After several years of being on the show, the ratings would dip considerably. According to Far Out magazine, it was approximately a 19% decline, and NBC would decide it was time for something new and fresh that could help SNL find a newer audience. Subsequently, in 1995, they would let go of Adam Sandler and others to pave the way for new stars. Adam actually talked about how he felt and how the firing happened on The Howard Stern Show.
When they fired you, it really caught you by surprise.
Put a lump in my throat. Again, I was probably sad into covering the sadness up with being mad and saying, yeah, fuck you, blah, 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 blah. This is how I got fired. My manager, Sandy, he was talking to me, and I said, yeah, next year on the show, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, maybe you don't go back next year. And I was like, I don't know, man. I still got a few more things. He's like, yeah, but you did it already. And I was like, I did it, but,
He didn't want you to know you were fired.
Yeah, it was
going to make
those.
it seem like you were quit.
Your idea.
Yeah. And I was like, yeah, I'll think about it.
While this was a very tough time for Sandler, he looks back on it with wisdom and grace. Howard Stern tries to talk him into trashing Lorne Michaels several times, but he refuses to do so. He would also go on to make some classic comedy movies such as Billy Madison the same year in 1995 and Happy Gilmore just a year later in 1996. These movies and several others would essentially launch Adam Sandler's career as a director/actor and also fan the flame that was his stand-up comedy career as well. He would also return 24 years later to host at Saturday Night Live in 2019, and he would sing a song about how he was fired with a brief cameo from Chris Rock, who was also fired, and also a mention of his good friend Chris Farley. Not all of the fired SNL cast members were able to land on their feet so elegantly, but Adam Sandler was one of the stars whose firing was arguably one of the best things that could have ever happened to his comedy career, considering the massive success that followed him after the fact. I have Chris Farley right after Adam Sandler because these two exited Saturday Night Live at the exact same time. I mentioned that Sandler rubbed some of the producers the wrong way, and it was mainly because of some of the practical jokes and pranks that he and Chris Farley often pulled off screen. For example, Chris and Adam would often go to the SNL offices located in Rockefeller Center while they were really high and prank call people and pretending to be a farting old woman. It's also reported that while Chris Farley was on drugs, he would moon people while riding in a limousine, and apparently one time he even took a dump off the 17th floor of Rockefeller Center. I mean, that's some serious shit. While being astonishingly hilarious on the set of Saturday Night Live, Chris Farley was also just a loose cannon who struggled with substances and made a lot of people uncomfortable. Chris Farley was actually a part of what was called the Bad Boys of SNL, which is just what they called the group of comedians that included him, Adam Sandler, David Spade, Rob Schneider, Tim Meadows, and Chris Rock. As mentioned mentioned earlier, Lorne Michaels, despite all the pranks they pulled, thought very highly of Adam and Chris as cast members for the show, but the network was looking to go a new direction with the show's style of comedy, and ultimately they forced Lorne's hand here, and Chris and Adam would not be brought back after their 1995 season. It was actually Chris Farley who broke the news to Sandler that the two would not be returning for their next season of SNL.
But I remember when I saw Farley and he said, "Me too, they don't want me either." We were both like, "F this shit." We got mad together, pretended we weren't sad and pretended this was for the best.
But this would not stop the two from moving forward with their careers on the big screen. Chris Farley would then appear in some of his best movies such as Billy Madison, Tommy Boy, and Beverly Hills Ninja. Unfortunately, Chris Farley's battle with substances would not conclude until after his death in 1997. Luckily for fans though, he was able to make one more memorable appearance in Norm Macdonald's movie titled Dirty Work that was released in 1998. If Chris hadn't overdosed, I think it's safe to say he would have been in several more movies with Adam Sandler and would have probably made his own triumphant return to Saturday Night Live to host the show many years later, just like Adam Sandler did. Whether you live in a van down by the river or not, I think we can all agree that Chris Farley certainly had a promising career after his removal from SNL that was tragically cut short by his struggle with addiction. Long before Julia Louis-Dreyfus's monumental success as Elaine from Seinfeld, she got her start as a cast member on Saturday Night Live in 1982 when she was just 21 years old. Despite this being a very lucrative deal as a young comedic actress, Julia does not look back fondly of her very brief stint on SNL. She was originally invited on the show after her performance at the Golden 50th Anniversary Jubilee, and she showed a lot of promise in the eyes of NBC. According to Julia's first-hand account, the set of Saturday Night Live during the mid-80s was very sexist, and a lot of cast members were involved in rampant drug use. The combination of the low-quality working environment and also her lack of understanding of the dynamics at SNL made Julia very upset, and led to her not wanting to remain a cast member on the show. Even though she did not enjoy her time on SNL, Julia still gave it her all in her performances, such as her impressions of Andie MacDowell and Ali MacGraw. While on the show, though, she would befriend Larry David during her final season, who also hated his time on the show as a writer, and this would open the door for her to act on Seinfeld later on in her career. While Julia was technically fired from Saturday Night Live, she would not fight to stay on the show after 1985 based on how miserable she was as a cast member. So even though she was not asked to come back, the decision for her to leave SNL was mutual between her and the producers of the show. After Julia left SNL, she would act in the movie Troll in 1986, and then several years later, Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld would create the hit NBC show Seinfeld and cast Julia as Elaine. Fun fact, Elaine from Seinfeld was the first fictional woman I ever had a crush on. But anyway, we also got to see Julia return to host Saturday Night Live later on, which is cool when you consider how much she hated her time on the show. It's nice to know she could leave the bad energy in the past and come back to have a great show. Even though Julia hated her brief stint on SNL and refused to stay, she would eventually end up back at NBC in a much more favorable way, to which she then enjoyed a very lavish career after the fact. Damon Wayans also had a very brief stint on Saturday Night Live in 1985. At the time of joining SNL, Damon was just a stand-up comedian who had just begun his journey in show business. Wayans joined for season 11 of SNL, which was a notable period where Lorne Michaels had returned as the showrunner after a 5-year hiatus, where he had distanced himself from his legacy position at Saturday Night Live. Damon Wayans did not handle the power structure between his creative control and what the show demanded of him very well. He would commonly have his ideas rejected by Lorne Michaels, and he was very limited in his roles, which did not allow him to showcase his unique talent. Instead of continuing to wrestle with the powers that be and beg to have his ideas showcased, Damon Wayans would take matters into his own hands. What happened next was Damon would be playing a cop alongside fellow cast members in the sketch called Mr. Monopoly. He did not believe in the sketch and thought it was incredibly unfunny, so live on the air he would make his character have a flamboyantly gay voice and really play up the stereotype. This strange decision by Damon Wayans made an otherwise bland sketch slightly more entertaining. However, Lorne Michaels would be pissed off and fired Damon literally minutes after this whole ordeal took place for insubordination. The season 11 ratings would be very poor, which led to most of the cast members being fired also, but not as abruptly and harshly as Damon Wayans was, obviously. It seemed like Damon wanted an active role on the show, and he was sick of not being able to do what he wanted. According to him, he felt like Lorne was just trying to protect him from being compared to Eddie Murphy, who had just left the cast of Saturday Night Live back in 1984. He also admitted that he wanted to get fired and felt like Lorne made the right decision given the circumstances. After he lost this job, he would be cast on his brother Keenan Ivory Wayans' sketch show titled In Living Color, which was a much better fit for him because he felt like everything he wasn't allowed to do on SNL, he was actually able to do on that show. Even though Lorne Michaels angrily fired Damon from the show, he held no ill will towards the young comedian and even invited him to do stand-up on the season finale of the show literally the same year he was fired. With Damon's success after being fired, it would turn out to be yet another comedian who would end up making a much better career for himself after his exit from Saturday Night Live. Laurie Metcalf was on season 6 of Saturday Night Live in 1981, but would only appear on one episode of the show that was shot on April 11th, 1981. This would make her the shortest tenured actress to ever appear on Saturday Night Live. She would not appear on any other episodes of the show given the timing of the 1981 Writers Guild of America strike. The amalgamation of the Writers Guild of America strike and SNL's hunger for new talent to increase ratings led to Laurie not being asked to return for the following season of Saturday Night Live. But this very brief time on the show gave her credibility, and she would go on to make many appearances in different movies for the next decade. She would also end up on several other TV shows, such as the set of Roseanne as Jackie Harris, and on the set of The Norm Show as Laurie Freeman, and she would continue to appear in many movies and TV shows throughout the rest of her career. While Laurie Metcalf may not have been as successful as someone like Adam Sandler was after being fired, she still continued to advance her career and didn't let the setback at NBC slow down her progression as a comedic actress.
Get up, Bob! Good God! So good!
In addition to being the most recent cast member fired from Saturday Night Live, Shane Gillis also got fired the quickest. Shane was fired from Saturday Night Live quite literally the exact same day it was announced publicly he got the job. What happened was back in 2019, some NBC executives attended the Clusterfest Comedy Festival where Shane was performing stand-up comedy. They really liked him and wanted him to fill out a submission packet to be a writer or cast member, but Shane wasn't interested in doing so and passed on this opportunity. Then they lowered the requirements based on Shane's level of talent and said he could skip that and just audition for the show. Then Shane did his audition and Lorne Michaels hired him. Then the day it was announced Shane would be joining the cast of Saturday Night Live, a spoken bird poet and journalist named Seth Simons tweeted a clip of Shane from his podcast titled Matt and Shane's Secret Podcast, where he had made some unsavory jokes that made him look pretty bad when taken out of context. Shane was trying to be funny when making these jokes, but of course people made the absolute worst of it. Lorne tried like hell to keep Shane on because he's usually making an attempt to be on the side of comedy, at least in my eyes, but the corporate pressure was too much, and SNL decided that Shane was done before his time on the show had even begun. Initially, when asked to respond to the claims made about him, Shane said he's a comedian who pushes boundaries. This was a statement that Shane would go on to regret making and looks back and feels like it was a corny response. However, Shane never harbored any ill will towards Lorne Michaels or any of the producers who made the decision to fire him. He actually expressed that he understands exactly why they made the decision that they did, and that he was just honestly happy for the opportunity at the end of the day.
Do you think that you would have fired you?
But under the rules, today's rules, yeah. You know what I mean? That's what I've always tried to say. Like, I don't argue me getting fired.
Right.
Those are today's rules.
Shane has talked about the Saturday Night Live firing many times and has always spoke on the record about it with extreme grace and poise. After the firing, Shane would focus on stand-up comedy and sketch comedy and would put out 2 amazing specials over the next few years, one on YouTube and one on Netflix. And even against all odds, he was invited back to host Saturday Night Live 5 years later, and he accepted the offer and gave a solid monologue that drew a lot of older fans back to the show show who have claimed the show had become increasingly unfunny over the years and that Shane was a breath of fresh air. Whether you think Shane killed, bombed, or just did okay, the fact that he was invited back on was a moral victory in and of itself for comedy. Shane Gillis was the most recent example of someone being fired from SNL, but sticking to his guns and believing in his own comedy led him to a much more lucrative career in comedy after the fact. Sarah Silverman also worked on Saturday Night Live for an incredibly brief period of time. Not as short as Laurie Metcalf's, but a notable stint nonetheless. Sarah had started stand-up comedy at the age of 17, and within 5 years she was hired by SNL to be a writer. Along with writing for the show in 1993, she would make the occasional appearance in sketches playing small roles. Even though she did her job to the best of her ability and never missed work, she would be fired by Fax after just 18 weeks of working on the show as a writer. When sat down by the Huffington Post for an interview, she jokingly stated that she felt like she hadn't written a single funny sketch while she was working on SNL.
How'd you get fired from SNL?
I mean, it wasn't like I did something wrong. I was hired, and the following season they fired. It was like a whole new kind of, I think that last year of the old guard, and they started anew. And by the way, I wrote not a single funny sketch, so that might have something to do with it too.
However, the reason cited for her firing was not performance issues, rather that she just didn't fit with the current comedic identity of the show. Because when she joined the show in 1993, the bad boys of SNL were the main attraction to the show, and most of the comedic identity of SNL revolved around their style of comedy. While Sarah Silverman did her job well as described by her peers, her comedic voice just did not blend well with that of Sandler, Chris Rock, Chris Farley, and the rest of those boys, because not a single sketch of hers would be picked up or make it past the dress rehearsals. However, Sarah wouldn't let her firing bring down the momentum in her career, and she'd go on to be very successful as a stand-up comedian and also as an actor, where she played multiple characters in The Simpsons, appeared in many different movies, and also starred in her own sitcom. Sarah had a very impressive career despite her firing, and she would even return to host SNL and did a very good job, all things considered. Sarah Silverman is hilarious.
Sarah Silverman, hysterical.
Right.
Who's funnier than her?
Nobody.
No, except dudes. But,
Nobody.
but
Robert Downey Jr. is one of the most successful and talented actors working in film today, but a lot of people don't know that before this, he was a cast member on Saturday Night Live back in 1985 for one season only. You may remember from earlier that 1985 was the same year on SNL that Damon Wayans was fired for going off script, but based on this season being a ratings disaster, it would lead to a lot of other cast members being fired as well, including Robert Downey Jr. Season 11 was considered by some to be the worst season of Saturday Night Live in the show's history. To make matters worse, some people consider Robert Downey Jr. to be the worst cast member of all time. It didn't help that Robert had expressed he was very uncomfortable with sketch comedy and that he wasn't itching to do impressions of anybody, given his background being in traditional filmmaking, and that he was never in an improv troupe. Given sketch comedy being a pillar of SNL, it's a mystery how Robert Downey Jr. was even picked up given his indifference towards being in sketches in the first place. He only had a few movies at the time, like Firstborn and Weird Science, so he wasn't riding some massive hype wave from his film roles like he would have been nowadays per se. Then after just one short season on the show, Robert Downey Jr. would not be asked to return along with most of the cast that year. It would seem Lauren had brought a lot of good talent for season 11, but the lack of cohesiveness and teamwork led to the lackluster ratings. Obviously, this would not affect Robert in the long term now because he would go on to act in some of the most successful movies of all time and subsequently become one of the highest paid and most revered actors of the last 2 decades. He would also be brought back to host SNL in 1996, where he would briefly mention how he was on the show for just one season. So even though he was fired from SNL, this was probably the best thing that could have happened to him in his career, given his acting style being a lot more conventional than just doing some goofy television sketches. Joan Cusack, similar to Robert Downey Jr. and Damon Wayans, was a part of the 1985 cast of Saturday Night Live's 11th season. As mentioned earlier, this season was a ratings disaster and is often cited as one of the worst, if not the worst, seasons of Saturday Night Live in history. Joan actually shared the stage with Robert Downey Jr., but they would both be out of a job at the end of the season. When asked about it, Joan expressed that it wasn't working for producers and that she also felt very out of place and miserable on the set of Saturday Night Live. Although her time on the show was very brief and unsuccessful by her and the network's word, similar to Robert Downey Jr., she would leave the show and ascend into the world of cinema and appear in some excellent movies. This was just one of those seasons where Lorne Michaels had come off of a long break and he decided to hire a bunch of new people, and when none of it worked, they all just got canned. So even though she was fired abruptly from Saturday Night Live, she would land on her feet and make a much better career for herself as an actress in a more conventional way. So far, most people have been fired from Saturday Night Live, but Larry David actually quit the show because he was miserable while working there. The story of how it all transpired is pretty interesting too. Larry David joined SNL in 1984 as a writer for one season only, and he had actually had plenty of writing experience on the ABC show Fridays for several years before getting the job at SNL. Larry was dissatisfied with the show though because his sketches would always get cut, and he never felt like any of his work came to fruition. So this led to him and Julia Louis-Dreyfus bonding over their misery working at Saturday Night Live. At the time, Lorne Michaels wasn't in charge of the show. It was actually a guy named Dick Ebersol. Dick was the person making the calls to cut sketches, so Larry had enough of this and decided to give Dick a piece of his mind. Larry actually talked about this whole situation on the Howard Stern show.
Within 5 weeks, you're completely irritated and disgusted with the job, right?
Yes.
Because they didn't recognize your genius. Am I correct?
My sketches would do very well at the read-through.
At the dress rehearsal.
Yes.
Yes.
And then they would invariably get cut, like week after week after week. One night before the show, another sketch of mine was cut. And at 11:25, 5 minutes before the show was to start, Dick was sitting in the chair, and I marched over to him.
Probably didn't even know who you were.
I marched over to him. I said, "This fucking show stinks! It stinks! It's shit! I'm done! I'm gone! This! I'm out!" Couldn't get a cab, walking home. And I'm starting to compute how much money I just cost myself.
Right, because you had a year contract.
Yeah.
The real Kramer, the guy you were living with, Kenny Kramer.
My next door neighbor,
right.
yeah.
He says, go back on Monday and pretend like it didn't happen.
That's exactly what I did.
So Larry had this outburst towards Dick and pretty much told him he was never coming back to the show, but then he decided to come back to work like nothing happened the next day. What a hilarious story. There's actually a funny episode of Seinfeld in season 2 called The Revenge, which is based on this real-life event where Larry quit SNL and then showed up the next day like nothing happened. It's a great episode if you haven't seen it. Even though Larry David still had the job, he was miserable and unfulfilled with his position based on his sketches being constantly cut from the show, so this would be the only season he worked as a writer on SNL. He ended up only having one of his sketches aired on the show, so it's no wonder that he looked elsewhere for work and ended up writing Seinfeld, where all the gags in the episodes were his and Jerry's unique ideas. When his contract was up, he would not put forth the effort to return to the writer's room at SNL, but he did return to host SNL back in 2017, where he talked about how far he had come since his time as a young man in New York City. Even though he didn't return to the show because of his frustration with the sketches he wrote being cut, he found success with Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm, which proves that Larry certainly landed on his feet when he left Saturday Night Live. Jenny Slate has perhaps one of the most famous mishaps on Saturday Night Live. She joined the show as a cast member in 2009 and would only be around for the 35th season of the show. There was one time where she accidentally cursed live on the show during a sketch, and immediately after the fact, you can see her react to this error in her face.
You freaking just threw an ashtray full of butts at my head. You know what? You stood up for yourself, and I fucking love you for that. You're in my heart, babe.
Some people think this is the reason Jenny Slate was fired, but ultimately this is untrue. I also think firing someone for accidentally slipping on a late-night comedy sketch show would be a pretty lame reason. She also didn't make a mistake like this for the rest of her time on the show. However, Jenny Slate, when asked about SNL and why she was fired, insists that she didn't feel like she was a good fit on the show as a cast member.
I had felt that it was a bad fit. Like, I really liked all the people there a lot. I didn't feel that they were a bad fit to be friends with, but I was not able to adjust into, for some reason, being like relaxed in that atmosphere.
She also feels like she didn't do her best work on the show, which plays into her not being a good fit, and Lauren probably saw it this way also. The live sketch slip aside, as we've heard many times on this video, some people just do not fit into the box of what SNL does, no matter how talented they are or aren't. Jenny moved on with her career and has been on several TV shows and movies, so even though she felt she wasn't a good fit on Saturday Night Live and was fired from the show, she ended up finding a lot of success in other realms of entertainment. So even though her time on SNL was brief, she learned from it and made the best out of her experience on the show.
Till about 2 a.m. and I call back and I hang up and I start to blame myself. Somebody help.
In the late 80s, Chris Rock had been doing stand-up comedy for several years, and Lorne Michaels saw some great potential in him. Then Chris joined Saturday Night Live in 1990 as a cast member and would stay on the show for 3 seasons. He was a part of the Bad Boys of SNL with the Sandler crew, and he'd appear in many Adam Sandler movies after both of their exits from Saturday Night Live. While Chris was on the show, he would notice a lot of the material and sketches that were written for him were in his eyes very hacky and stereotypical. He would express these concerns to Lorne Michaels, and Lorne understood his frustration but really didn't seem to mitigate anything and just let the show and writers continue the way it was going. Furthermore, in the same breath, Chris also expressed an interest in the sketch show In Living Color, which had a cast that was majority black. Given Chris Rock's plan to leave the show and join In Living Color, he was not invited back for the next season, meaning he was effectively fired from the show, although not outright terminated like some of the other cast members on this list. Sadly, when Chris went to In Living Color, the show would end up being canceled not long after he arrived. Regardless, Chris Rock would continue appearing in movies and touring across the country doing stand-up comedy, which would eventually pay off because now Chris is considered by many comedians working today as one of the greatest comedians of all time, if not the greatest. He would also return to host Saturday Night Live 3 separate times, and he did well each and every time he returned. He also makes regular cameos as well, like for the Eddie Murphy monologue and also the Adam Sandler monologue. Even though Chris Rock was technically fired from SNL, he cemented an amazing legacy in comedy and cinema alike, and Lorne Michaels always thought highly of him no matter what it was he did and never held a grudge when he expressed interest in going to another show. Taran Killam had one of the longer runs on Saturday Night Live when compared to everyone else on the list. Taran joined Saturday Night Live in September 2010, where he would remain for 6 seasons. He had previously appeared on the sketch show Mad TV back in 2001 and several other TV shows, so he had experience as a sketch comedian and actor before getting the gig with SNL. According to Taran, he was signed for 7 years, so he was literally 1 season shy of when he originally thought he was going to leave the show. However, Lorne Michaels fired him the season before, and he didn't really give a super solid reason for it. When giving a reason, Lorne Michaels essentially said that Saturday Night Live has always been about change and that they were seeking a new comedic identity for the show, so some of the old cast members such as Taran and Jay needed to go to keep a fresh blend of comedy coming into the show. Lorne also believed Taran would find plenty of success away from the show, and Taran also stated on the record that SNL did take a bit of a toll on his mental health and how working on the show was extremely stressful at times given all the pressure you face as a cast member.
SNL was really kind of the first time where it made me a level of insecure I had not experienced before. I cared so much what everybody thought of me because I loved that job and I loved that place, and everybody was so funny and so smart.
So Taran felt stressed out because of all the funny people on the show, but he loved the job dearly, which certainly must have made his surprise firing sting a lot more than usual. We would end up seeing a lot of similar criticisms present by Andy Samberg when talking about working on the cast of Saturday Night Live. Sadly for Taran, he was never really given a crystal clear reason by Lorne Michaels for why he was fired from the show, but aside from that, he found himself in many other TV shows and movies in the future, so his career continued in an upward trajectory after the fact. Aside from the blindsided firing, Taran had a very successful stint working on Saturday Night Live for 6 seasons.
That's my bitch. Shorty right there, that's my bitch.
Fun fact about Jay Pharoah, him and Taran Killam were hired and fired at the exact same time, so I felt it was convenient to talk about him immediately after Taran. Jay had been doing stand-up for years before he got the gig on Saturday Night Live. Jay Pharoah was most well known for his impressions on SNL, specifically his Barack Obama impression, which is pretty damn good and hilarious. He also served 6 seasons on the show, and the reason cited for his firing was exactly the same as what he said for Taran Killam in terms of the show, trying to change its comedic identity and forcing some of the old cast members out in an effort to do this. However, Jay Pharoah also voiced that he felt he was fired from SNL for other reasons as well, such as his reluctance to be a yes man, and also his refusal to wear a dress on set for sketches. This may be true, but we may never truly know for sure. All we know is that Lorne Michaels made the decision he did because he felt the show needed change at the time, and that it needed to turn over a new leaf. Jay's unwillingness to do certain things could have aided in this decision to fire him and Taran Killam, but it cannot be 100% confirmed. Similar to Taran though, Jay did find success after the fact given the national exposure he received from SNL, and he's currently on a nationwide comedy tour while also appearing in several TV shows and movies. So despite the blindsided firing for Jay Pharoah and Taran Killam, they both made leaps and bounds in their career after their long stints on Saturday Night Live. Rob Riggle was on Saturday Night Live very briefly in 2004 for the 30th season. Before SNL, Rob Riggle was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps who had literally just returned from a deployment in the Middle East. However, he was a reservist, which allowed him more time in his life to focus on being a comedian and actor. Because while he was on SNL, he continued to serve in the Marine Corps. SNL was a huge deal for Rob because it was one of the first times in his career where he received national exposure across the country. Even though it ended up being a disaster for Rob that only lasted 1 season, it was one of his dreams to be on Saturday Night Live, and he made it happen. When Rob joined that season, he was the only person added as a cast member, which meant that everyone else knew each other and was comfortable around each other, while Rob was the token new face of the season. This was probably not the best decision by Lorne to throw in one newbie along with 14 veteran cast members, because it led to Rob feeling super out of place and not quite in his element. He even echoed issues that other people have said throughout this video, such as the pace being incredibly brisk, the pressure being immense to deliver consistently, and also by the end of the season, he didn't even know if he was funny anymore. Even though Rob was fired after the season, it was a very special circumstance for him, and he was thankful he got the opportunity and was allowed to complete the season also, because not all cast members who are fired get to finish the season that they're on. Even with just 1 season, Rob was able to hit the ground running and start appearing in some legendary comedy movies such as Step Brothers in 2008, The Hangover in 2009, and 21 Jump Street in 2012. Even if his time on SNL ended abruptly by being fired, he had memorable roles in several other movies and continues his success as a comedian and actor to this day. Andy Samberg is another example of someone who was not fired from Saturday Night Live, but was driven away after the severe toll it took on his mental and physical health. Andy joined SNL back in 2005 for the 31st season of the show, and he would remain a cast member for 7 long seasons. At this point, he was the head of the comedy trio known as the Lonely Island.
I call him Sandberg and the other couple of fellas.
And while Samberg was picked up as a cast member, the other 2 fellas were picked up as writers for the show. Given the hours of the show and the stressful scheduling he endured, over time Andy felt like he hadn't gotten a good night's sleep in 7 years. Not to mention in Andy's last few years on the show, he was alone because his peers from the Lonely Island were fired from the writer's room, so he was basically facing this grueling work schedule all by himself without the support from his 2 best friends. Not to mention keeping up with the Lonely Island's independent projects off screen also. He really appreciated the megaphone that SNL was for his ideas that he would have, and getting them in front of comedy fans, but the toll it took on his well-being ended up being too much. When Andy had talked to other cast members, a lot of them understood his desire to leave the show. Then when he talked to Lorne Michaels, they specifically told him they would really like it if he stayed, which made the situation that much harder for him. He would end up leaving the show, but he would come back to host the show in 2014, where he would do some impressions in his monologue. Andy would continue to be wildly successful after Saturday Night Live, and even though he was struggling to take care of himself on the show and he felt like his life was falling apart, he looks back fondly at his time on Saturday Night Live, and his peers and the producers seem to feel positively about his impact on the show as well. Andy Samberg actually came out and talked about this recently on Peacock with Kevin Hart. But even after his exit, Andy Samberg remains a fan favorite of longtime SNL fans and a legend in the world of comedy. Michaela Watkins is an actress and comedian that joined Saturday Night Live in 2008 for the 34th season. Even though she was a cast member for only one season on the show, she did have a memorable appearance on Weekend Update as the Bitch Please blogger. A lot of people really loved this bit, and they thought Michaela would certainly be a recurring cast member in the sketches. In fact, if you look at the comments on the Bitch Please blogger clip on YouTube, a lot of the comments are talking about how much of a missed opportunity it was to fire Michaela and not have her appear on many other sketches to utilize her unique quirkiness and talent. She did an interview with Entertainment Weekly where she was asked about her brief stint at Saturday Night Live, and her answer was very surprising as to what the hell Lorne Michaels was thinking when he fired her. When asked why Lorne would do this, she said that Lorne had expressed to her that she should have her own show and that he didn't feel she was a good fit for SNL. So he essentially gave her a backhanded compliment by saying, "I'm doing what is best for the show by firing you, and also you deserve your own show too because of how talented you are." A little bit of a strange decision, but nonetheless, this is what he told Michaela. The soft letdown didn't make the decision any less shocking for her, and while she was sad to go, she was incredibly thankful for the time she got to spend at Saturday Night Live. The good thing for Michaela, though, is she took Lorne's advice straight to heart and started appearing on many other TV shows where she had lead roles, and she got to showcase her unique talent that was underutilized by SNL. So even though she was fired by Lorne for a pretty fuzzy reason, she landed on her feet into a successful career in the wide world of entertainment. Casey Wilson, similarly to Michaela Watkins, is an actress and comedian that was on Saturday Night Live in 2008 for the 34th season, and they would both leave the show at the exact same time. She was on the show for a single season and had a couple small sketches similar to Michaela Watkins, but nothing quite as noteworthy as the Bitch Please blogger sketch that Michaela had. There were several rumors about why she was fired instead of having her contract renewed the following season. She actually spoke on Radio Andy about the whole situation, so CNN and other publications had originally written an article about her being fired for being fat, which obviously wasn't true. The same article I used for Michaela Watkins mentioned that Casey Williams had been axed from the show as well, but it didn't say that Lorne gave her the same reason for why she was let go. By all means, Lorne thought that Casey Wilson should have her own show as well, but that was not expressed in the article I read. But Casey did express she felt like she wasn't a great fit for the show, given that she's more of a comedy actress than a sketch performer. So naturally there wasn't an alignment between what Saturday Night Live's goal with her was and what she wanted from her time on the show. In this instance, it really didn't appear that there was a solid written in stone reason for why Casey Wilson was fired, mainly that she just didn't click as a cast member on the show anymore. However, she landed on her feet after her abrupt firing from SNL with some great TV shows and movies that she would appear in later on in her career.
I'm like an R-A-P-E-R, got so many essays. Wait, he didn't just spell the word rapper and leave out a P, did he?
Horatio Sanz had one of the darker turns of events for his career on television. Horatio joined Saturday Night Live as a cast member in 1998 for season 24 of the show. He worked on the show for 8 seasons until 2006, and the reason cited for his firing was budget cuts at NBC, and Lorne was forced to abruptly ask several different cast members as well to leave the show. However, some disturbing allegations came out years later about Horatio Sanz. In 2021, a lawsuit was released about him where where he was accused of taking advantage of a woman and making sexually explicit comments at her while she was underage. This wasn't just any woman though. Apparently she was a superfan of Saturday Night Live, and she met Horatio at an SNL after-party where the alleged abuse took place. This presented a power dynamic that was seen by many as problematic. The lawsuit also stated that both Saturday Night Live and NBC permitted and enabled him to groom and harm her, and that apparently this happened in front of other cast members and staff in May 2002 while Horatio was actively on SNL. This was a bombshell allegation that ended up being settled out of court by Horatio and the alleged victim, but Horatio Sanz' lawyer insisted that the allegations levied against him were categorically false. I'm not an expert and I don't know what that means, but since this whole situation, Horatio Sanz has not appeared in any other movies or TV shows, but apparently now Horatio can be seen performing with the comedy troupe Ass Cat 3000, which performs in New York City and Los Angeles. Aside from that, after his firing, he was in quite a few movies, but I have no idea currently what is next for Horatio Sanz. Chris Parnell is the only cast member of Saturday Night Live to be fired twice. He joined SNL back in 1998 and would remain there for 8 years until 2006. He was given the nickname Iceman by Colin Quinn because of how good he was at remaining calm under pressure. However, after the 1998 season, Lorne Michaels felt that Chris Parnell was not a good fit on the show and let him go. But then several months after that, he thought about his decision and went back on it. He then called Chris out of the blue and asked him if he would return for the following season, and Chris accepted this offer, and the next 7 years would really be when Chris started to make a name for himself on the show. One of the most unique characteristics about him was his voice, and how almost anything he delivered could be hilarious. However, many years later in 2006, Lorne would be forced to fire Chris for the second time, but for a completely different reason. Initially, Lorne didn't think Chris was a good fit for the show, but this time in 2006, NBC had been dealing with budget cuts, which led to Chris being let go, similarly to Horatio Sanz. However, after the firing, he would go on to become Dr. Leo Spaceman on the sitcom 30 Rock. So even though the insufficient funds at NBC couldn't afford him at SNL, they moved him to a successful sitcom after his firing, which allowed Chris Parnell to land on his feet as a comedian and actor.
Too bad that you had to get caught. That's not like you to lose face.
Alright everyone, this is the part you've all been waiting for. Norm Macdonald joined SNL as a cast member in 1993, where he acted in some funny sketches like his cold opening as Bob Dole, the zoo sketch with Chris Farley, or the psychologist in the multiple personality sketch. But his bread and butter on Saturday Night Live was a year later when he began hosting the Weekend Update news routine and made some of the funniest jokes we've ever seen on television. To a lot of people, Norm Macdonald is considered the greatest Weekend Update host of all time, and in addition to that, probably the most fearless Weekend Update host of all time as well. He would be let go in 1997 after being on the show for 4 years, and for a long time, a lot of people speculated that it was because of the constant jokes about O.J. Simpson. The lore behind this is a little long, but I'll do my best to explain it. So one of the executive producers at NBC's name was Don Ohlmeyer, and he was good friends with O.J. Simpson. And O.J. Simpson would proceed to be accused of murdering his wife and a waiter, and the trial would be a huge deal in the United States of America. So when the case concluded and OJ was acquitted, he asked Norm to stop making jokes since the trial was over. Norm continued to make jokes about OJ despite Don Ohlmeyer's wishes, and Norm talks about this on Letterman's show, which he appeared on directly after getting fired.
No, you didn't get fired.
Yeah, they fired me.
No, they didn't fire you.
No, I'm serious. I talked to a guy that said I'm fired. They said that this guy, Don Ohlmeyer, turns out to be the president.
Yeah, now I know Don Ohlmeyer, and
Yeah.
just between you and me, he's an idiot.
Oh. So he goes, oh yeah, I'm firing you there from the show. And then I said, oh, that's not good. You know? And I said, why is that now? And he goes, oh, you're not funny.
Yeah.
And then I said, oh, Lord, that's even worse news, you know?
The way Norm frames the conversation he had while getting fired makes it seem like the OJ jokes are what got him in hot water and then got him canned, when in reality, this is not the real reason Norm was let go. What actually happened was one of the head writers of Weekend Update at the time was a guy named Jim Downey. He would help Norm write a lot of the OJ jokes, and after that whole ordeal, NBC decided they were going to fire Jim Downey. Whether he was fired for the OJ jokes or just because the show needed something new is undetermined. What happened next, though, was the producers talked to Norm and they said they were going to fire Jim and if he was okay with that, and Norm valiantly defended his friend and said he's not okay with this decision. Then he took it a step further and he also said if they fire Jim Downey, they'll have to fire him too. Nobody knew this for years until Jim Downey sat down with Conan and told him this story.
The network went to Norm and said, we want to get rid of Jim Downey, and we just want you to know you're cool with that, right? He said, no. If you fire him, I quit. And they go, that's crazy. I mean, he's not helping you, And he said, well, no, I'm not doing it without him. And he never told me that. And I didn't hear that for years. I heard it from some network executives. And and part of everything else, if that had been me, that would have been, you bet Norm would have heard.
And then when asked about it on TV, he blames himself and refuses to tell anyone that he was standing in solidarity with Jim. What a man of fucking character. Not only was he a funny guy, but he was a very good guy too. Norm Macdonald to me is the greatest comedian to ever live, and he's a world-class human being who took this secret to the grave because he didn't want to big brother Jim Downey and make himself look like a good guy. It's one thing to not tell people publicly that you stood up for somebody else, but to not even tell that person you stood up for them is an otherworldly level of character and humility. Because Jim Downey did not know this until one of the producers at NBC actually told him about it. If they didn't tell him about Norm doing this, then he would have never known. What an insane turn of events for Norm Macdonald. And then after a year of being fired, Norm went into the world of show business, got his own TV show, The Norm Show, and would be invited back onto SNL to host the show very soon after. And if you haven't seen what Norm did when he hosted SNL after a year of being gone, God, are you in for a treat.
When the people here asked me to do the show, I gotta say, I felt kind of weird, I don't know if you remember this, but I used to actually be on this show, So you see, they fired me because they said that I wasn't funny, Now, so I wondered, I go, hey, wait a second here. Hey! I go, how did I go in a year and a half from being not funny enough to be even allowed in the building to being so funny that I'm now hosting the show? Then it occurred to me, I haven't gotten funnier. The show has gotten really bad. So yeah, I'm funny compared to, well, you'll see later, but...
He takes the cited reason why he was banned from SNL and shoves it right in their goddamn face, and they can't do a thing about it. All they can do is boo from the back while Norm continues to steal the show. And then he absolutely rips SNL with a brilliant monologue. And we on this channel know better than anyone that he certainly landed on his feet after his firing, because he went on to have an extremely successful career and became adored by comedy fans to no end, and is widely regarded as one of the greatest comedic minds of all time. All in all, these are the many victims of Saturday Night Live. Of course, not all of them suffered super traumatic incidents while working, and some of them probably wouldn't even consider themselves victims, but they all dealt with some negative ramifications on their way out from the show that I felt was noteworthy and a story worth telling. No hate directed at Saturday Night Live or Lorne Michaels with this video. I sincerely believe Lorne does his best to make decisions that land on the side of comedy, but when you have a multi-billion-dollar corporation behind you, obviously you must pick your battles very wisely. Anyway, I really hope you guys learned something new from this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to show your support. Let me know in the comments who your favorite cast member is who got fired, as if I don't know the answer already, and which one surprised you the most. But that's all I got for you guys. I love you, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.